welcome to episode 2 of the LightWeavers Book Club. In this episode, our heroes continue their discussion of Bob Podolsky's book Flourish, covering such topics as rules and laws versus ethics and principles, the application of natural law to ethical thinking, the importance of romantic love, psychopathy, and why it may be a bad idea to rely on technology to help us get along. You won't hear much from me for the rest of this episode. Due to user error, my microphone recorded a constant low-grade hum rather than the sound of my voice, as one of these things would usually do. I believe I have this problem solved for future episodes, but this time you'll have to make do without my mellifluous yammering. That being stated, the journey through this episode will be a bit more of an abstract one, but I trust it will remain a pleasant and useful catalyst to your own thinking. The way that things worked out this week, it's going to make more sense if I just put the whole section of the book right up front, and then you guys can hear the discussion afterwards. Chapter 3, Institutional Analysis of the Big Problem. As I started looking for answers, I began applying a variety of intellectual tools, namely the scientific method, the operational point of view, formal systems analysis, archaeology, characterology, economics, history, logic, math, neurolinguistics, organizational development, political science, psychology, and sociology. It wasn't long before I realized that societal institutions are pretty easy to analyze given the right tools. The first important realization that came my way was that these problems, bureaucracy, corruption, crime, drug addiction, exploitation, genocide, hunger, ignorance, poverty, pollution, race hatred, slavery, violence, and war, are not actually separate problems at all, but merely symptoms of one big problem that stems from the propensity of our institutions to make unethical decisions. When we eliminate this problem, the symptoms will all but evaporate. So where do we start? Let's start by acquiring a deeper understanding of the relationships between ethics, law, and government. To do this, we need first to understand the ethics. Chapter 4, Ethics, Law, and Government. The ethics. As most people are aware, ethics are the means by which we decide what actions are permissible and what actions are not. What is less known is the fact that every ethic consists of two parts. One, a value that defines what it is that we want more of in our lives, what we wish to maximize, and two, a belief or system of beliefs that describes what actions we are to take to obtain more of the value that we seek. Still less often recognized is the fact that an ethic may be valid or invalid. Valid ethics produce the desired results, an increase in the value sought. Invalid ethics produce the opposite effect, a lessening of that which is sought or desired. As an example, consider the ethic adopted by our country's founders. The value they wished to maximize was freedom for the country's people, or at least for the white male property owners. The belief system was based on the principles of a democratic republic honoring majority rule. What has been the outcome? Each year but two, 1865 and 1920, or emancipation and suffrage, we have had less freedom than the year before. Today, through the proliferation of ever more restrictive laws, almost every aspect of our lives is regulated or controlled by our federal, state, county, and municipal governments. Without government permission, we cannot own property, drive a car, board a plane, alter our home, open a bank account, operate a business, ingest prescribed medication, carry a firearm, or do any of 1,000 other things that our forefathers and foremothers would have considered to be our unalienable rights. In short, we see that the founders of our country chose to adopt an ethic that is invalid because its adoption produced the opposite effect of that desired. This does not mean that I do not respect the founding fathers for the great accomplishment at great personal sacrifice to them for throwing off the oppressive shackles they faced at that time. From a scientific perspective, they didn't get the experiment exactly correct. Had they, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Another striking example is the history of the Soviet Union, which was based on the value of material well-being for everyone. The prevailing belief system was the doctrine of communism. The result was almost universal poverty, and so the ethic was invalid. While we're on the subject of ethics, let's consider two other specific ethics that are especially relevant to an understanding of the dilemma that humanity currently faces. The first I shall offer as the power ethic. This ethic seeks to maximize power over others in the hands of those who adopt it. The belief system that supports this ethic can be summarized by the statement, might makes right. In other words, those who can afford to buy weaponry and to pay or coerce young men and women to use those arms in battle have the right to exercise power over others for whatever reasons they wish. This is the ethic adopted by those who invented government as we know it in Sumer 8,000 years ago. This ethic is still the creed of those who run governments of the world today. At first it might seem that the power ethic is valid because indeed those who have adopted it have succeeded in accumulating more and more power over their fellow men and women. But there are secondary consequences. Including among these are wars, terrorism, slavery, hunger, poverty, international strife, drug addiction, interpersonal violence, bureaucracy, oligarchy, environmental degradation, and all manner of crimes. If the macroscopic trend continues, it is more than likely that the end result will be the total annihilation of all human life on our planet, thus reducing the Earth to a radioactive cinder. Like a ubiquitous parasite, those who have adopted the power ethic will destroy their host and themselves with it. So in the end, the power ethic is not valid. By contrast, consider an ethic that chooses creativity and its logical equivalents as the values to be maximized. Such resources as love, awareness, objective truth, and personal evolution may be considered as logical equivalents of creativity because whenever one of these resources is increased, they are all increased and vice versa. John David Garcia, the brilliant author of Creative Transformation, called this ethic the evolutionary ethic, and so I will do likewise. We might note at this point that all prosperity, and ultimately all happiness, derives from someone's creativity. The belief system that empowers this ethic begins with the notion that an act is good if it increases creativity or any of its logical equivalents for at least one person, without limiting or diminishing creativity for anyone. From this definition, a broad range of principles can be derived by simple logic. This ethic, it turns out, is valid. Curiously, the adoption of this ethic generally maximizes prosperity and happiness even though these are not logical equivalents of creativity. In fact, ethics based on the maximization of prosperity or happiness is not valid, producing poverty and unhappiness instead. From this point on, I shall use the terms ethical and unethical in reference to this ethic specifically. There are several other valid ethics which I choose not to discuss in this book, except to note that each of them proves upon close examination to be logical equivalents of the evolutionary ethic, in that they call for the same behavioral decisions when deciding between alternative courses of action. From the foregoing, we can see that humanity's big problem is the fact that the world's governments, without exception, have chosen the power ethic as their de facto basis rather than the evolutionary ethic or one of its logical equivalents. The big question that humanity faces today is whether this choice is irreversible, and if not, what we must do to avoid the doom that the power ethic is leading us toward. About the law. In an ethical society, freedom is limited by ethical law. Those who wish to behave in a parasitic or predatory manner are forbidden to do so. The mistake of our founding fathers was to maximize freedom in such a way that the most predatory, parasitic, and generally unethical persons were permitted to dictate the law, thereby making the rules that allowed the ultra-wealthy to dominate the rest of us. We must reverse this trend if humanity is to survive, let alone thrive. To achieve this end, we must understand the nature of ethical law and refute the validity of unethical law. To aid in clarifying this distinction, I shall refer to unethical laws as government edicts, or simply as edicts. In making this distinction, let's ask the question, what is law? Does a person who has the resources to exercise power over others have the right to do so? If so, might makes right, and anyone who can afford to buy weapons and persuade others to use them to enforce their will has the right to do so. This is the premise upon which all of today's governments are founded. This has been the true basis of law throughout the world for at least 8,000 years since the government was invented in Sumer. When we reject the validity of this definition, as indeed we should, what is the alternative? To answer this question properly, we note first that all law presumes the use of force or power over others. But it takes only a simple exercise of logic to see that the exercise of power over others is only ethical in self-defense against someone who has initiated or threatened the use of force for their own purposes. Therefore, ethical laws are only those that provide defense against such unethical acts. Since everyone has the right to defend themselves against the use of violence, it follows that everyone has the right to delegate to others their authority to defend themselves. From this, we conclude that all ethical laws embody this principle. All ethical laws, all legitimate laws, represent a contract under which a group of individuals, each having the right of self-defense, agrees to enforce a mutual defense pact. Ethical law can exist for this purpose alone. Furthermore, we note that all existing laws and edicts forbid some act or permit the act only when a tax is paid to the government. Thus, laws and edicts fall into two categories delineated by the Latin names of the categories of acts which they forbid. 1. Mala in se are acts generally recognized to be evil in and of themselves. These forbidden acts include murder, rape, torture, slavery, theft, robbery, fraud, assault, and a host of related acts long ago recognized as evils by the general public. The forbidding of mala in se is the basis of all legitimate laws, all other laws comprising artifacts of the power ethic. 2. Mala prohibita are acts which are not evil in and of themselves, but which have been forbidden because someone wants to impose their will upon someone else. The vast majority of these power ethic edicts forbidding mala prohibita are readily recognized by one or more of three characteristics. A. These edicts take resources, money for example, away from one group of individuals who own them and bestow them upon another group of individuals who do not own them. While taxes in their various forms comprise most of these instances, government takings by eminent domain are another example. Confiscation of assets of unconvicted arrestees compromises still another example. These edicts forbid acts which are ethical and or require acts which are unethical. The embodiment of these edicts requires the delegation to a governing body of authority which the legislators do not possess as individuals. In other words, they permit groups of people, e.g. legislators and law enforcement officials, to commit acts which would be illegal if performed by them as individuals. From the foregoing, we can logically conclude that the actions required for the enforcement of edicts forbidding mala prohibita are themselves mala in se. From these simple considerations, we can now describe how our legal system must fundamentally change if we are ever to live in an ethical society. The following description is not sufficient for the creation of an ethical society, but it is necessary. Absent these changes, those who believe that might makes right will continue their parasitic depredations, and the other changes that are necessary and sufficient for the emergence of an ethical society will never take place. For us to live in a just and ethical society, the law must be changed. Indeed, the legal system itself must be changed. Stated briefly, this means that we must stop enforcing laws against mala prohibita and delete these edicts from the law books. Let's examine more closely what such an undertaking entails. We start by reviewing the definition of an ethical act. An act is ethical if it increases creativity or any of its logical equivalents for at least one person, including the person acting, without limiting or diminishing the creativity of anyone. The following secondary principles follow logically from the definition above and are specifically relevant to the actions of government or the state. I've included a brief explanation of those that seem to need it. For the rest, I leave the proof to the reader. Ethical principles. 1. Ownership is absolute. The first requirement for the formation of a just society is that the public understand what is at stake. The basic principles of ethics and law are simple. They can be taught to children at an early age, beginning with the concept that ownership is absolute. Ownership is not a privilege granted by government, and it may not legitimately be denied or taken away by government except under the following two special circumstances. A. When the purpose of such confiscation is restitution, whereby property that has been stolen by force, coercion, deceit, or edict-based ploy is returned to its rightful owners, or B. When the property confiscated is used by someone to violate another's rights, as when a law enforcement person disarms a violent or threatening perpetrator. Any grade schooler can understand this. It is why, as small children, we feel violated when our parents insist we share something that we had been told we owned. 2. Violation of ownership is theft, and theft is unethical. As a logical consequence, property taxes, estate and inheritance taxes, duties, tariffs, and sales taxes must be abolished, thus acknowledging that government holds no ownership interest in the property currently being taxed. Of course, the same principle applies to all other taxes as well. Under our current system, all real property, i.e. real estate, is taxed by government entities, usually at the county level. Such taxes constitute a form of rent paid by the would-be owner of the property. This practice would be appropriate if government owned the property, but in reality the government owns nothing that is not taken from its rightful owners by deceit, force, or coercion. 3. Ongoing theft is slavery. When someone takes another's money or property by force or coercion, the theft is called robbery. When this occurs on an ongoing basis, the theft comprises an act of slavery. Thus, the taxation of revenue, as in the case of income taxes, is a case at point. It is slavery, a malum in se, and must be abolished for an ethical society to exist. See Appendix D for more on this subject. 4. Unethical means can never achieve ethical ends. This principle, though not in obvious consequences of the ethics, is so widely not understood that I've included a detailed explanation in Appendix E. 5. All ethical means are ethical ends in themselves. 6. The exercise of power over others or coercion is unethical, except in self-defense. 7. No individual has a right to perform any unethical act. 8. No individual can delegate to another a right that he or she does not possess. 9. No group, and therefore no government agency, can ethically perform acts which would be unethical if performed by an individual. 10. No government has a right to perform unethical acts. 11. Acts of government must be ethical to be legitimate, and therefore government acts which are not ethical are not legitimate. 12. Only enactment of ethical laws and their enforcement are legitimate acts of government, and therefore written government mandates that allow government to steal from or enslave individuals are not legitimate laws. They are rather illegitimate edicts. 13. Government edicts constitute predatory manipulations of the public in the service of special interests. 14. The same reasoning applies to unethical regulations created and enforced by all government agencies. From the above principles, we can logically conclude that 1. All legitimate laws must be ethical, and that 2. It is unethical and hence illegitimate for government to act in predatory edicts in the name of law. That is about how far we got in the book this week, so from here on our discussion will continue. We join our compatriots already in progress.
One of the questions that comes up frequently is, what do I mean by love? Because love is something that there are many different words for it, many different varieties of love. And I actually have a video on YouTube about what is love. And the best definition that I know of, that I find the most useful, is that love is a commitment that one makes to the well-being of another person. That's a very general definition, but of course that leads to the question of what do I mean by commitment? And if you make a commitment, what does that really mean? I like to explain that with a little metaphor. When you have a breakfast of ham and eggs, you might ask, well, what's involved in that? And clearly the chicken was involved in producing the egg, or eggs. The pig was committed. The pig was committed in producing your ham and egg breakfast. So when I use the word committed, it is somewhat in that sense, that you actually regard the thing you're committed to as very, very important. Maybe important enough to die for or to live for, but deeply important. And so that's what I'm talking about. When I talk about love, I'm talking about a commitment that one person makes to the well-being of another. That's to answer your earlier question. That's an individual level thing,
Yeah.
and I don't think that it has a group context or a social context that makes it applicable to a group, except as individuals experience it in relation to one another. There's another book that is very relevant to that. It's by Harville Hendrix. It's Hendrix with an X on the end. Harville Hendrix wrote a book called Getting the Love You Want. And it goes into this very question in some very interesting detail. I think it's the best book out there when it comes to understanding relationships, and especially relationships that are entered into with the hopes of there being long-term relationships, durable relationships. That book made a huge beneficial change in my life, and I recommend it to anyone who is interested in having a good solid long-term relationship. I credit that book with my having had a 38-year positive relationship with my wife, Leah. It really made a huge difference to us, and it's very, very relevant to this whole thing about what is this commitment we call love? How does it manifest? What are its dynamics? Extremely powerful. Very well worthwhile book for anyone who is interested in improving relationships with other people, especially what we would call romantic relationships or love relationships. I guess I want to ask whether everyone's clear about this differentiation between an ethic that's valid and one that is not valid or invalid, because that is one of the crucial key concepts in the whole book right there, that subscribing to a valid ethic or adopting a valid ethic or committing to a valid ethic is a very important step in anybody's life. And that applies both individually and in groups. A group that shares a valid ethic as their purpose, so to speak, has a great advantage over those that don't. But it's not easy to come by that.
Is that part of the education system? I mean, because I've been studying this sort of stuff for a long time, but it may have been self-directed. But I kind of feel like my parents talked about that, so maybe it's something that came from the family, and I just took it natural. But it just dumbfounds me that you have people that like would not even know where to start with that. So then the cognitive dissonance kicks in, and they start defending something they never thought about. They had just adopted it without thought. They've been playing that game, and now somebody's challenged it, and they've got to come up with the defenses in split seconds, and it's amazing. Oh yeah, there's a lot of ethics. I guess these are ethics. Oh, I guess I've adopted many of these ethics, these rules, and I never really thought about them. We've never even discussed them.
I want to address what you just said about ethics and rules, because it is not possible to create a rule that conveys the information inherent in an ethic. You cannot reduce an ethic to a set of rules. And my example of that is, if you give me a set of rules that you claim is an ethic, I can describe a circumstance where following those rules would lead to what is clearly an unethical outcome. There has to be room for exceptions, changes, variety. You have to take into account Gödel's incompleteness theorem that basically says, among other things, Gödel was the mathematician who figured out that every set allows you to create a well-formed statement that cannot neither be proven nor disproven. This is a very abstract concept, but it applies to many, many very real things that happen in the world. And the shortest, briefest illustration of it that I know is the statement, quote, "This statement is false," unquote. Now you'll notice that in the English language, that's a well-formed statement. However, you cannot prove that it is true or that it is false. It's an unprovable statement, and this is an inherent property of every language, every system of thought, every set of concepts and ideas. So it's an inescapable reality, and this is why you cannot make a set of rules that capture the meaning of an ethic. An ethic has just two parts: a value that you want to maximize, a belief system that tells you how to act in order to maximize the thing you want to maximize. And the most powerful illustration of that I know of is the ethic that states an act is ethical if it increases awareness, truth, creativity, and or love for at least one person, including the person acting, without limiting or diminishing any of those resources for anyone. I claim that this is a valid ethic, and it is the ethic I've devoted my life to since 1985. And I recommend it to people because it works. You follow that belief system, and sure enough, you get more of the things that you really value: awareness, truth, creativity, and love. And incidentally, happiness, prosperity, and various other kinds of well-being. That they're incidental benefits that you get when you adopt that particular ethic. So I just wanted to be on record for saying that don't equate ethics with rules. Most people do, but it's a big mistake.
I wanted to do rules in quotes, but I didn't. But I appreciate the distinction, and I get it. Now, with those ethics, though, there's got to still be room for disagreement, right? I mean, it doesn't sound like it can be a panacea, because people still disagree with the second that the corollary, or what?
Yeah, you
crazy
can do
that it,
absolutely.
Hey, it does hurt others, or no, it doesn't hurt others. You're thinking this is a detriment. I don't believe that it is, or something like that. There's still room for disagreement. It doesn't seem like. In other words, it's not asking everybody to be a rubber stamp. It sounds like to me, which I think is a benefit, but others might call it a flaw.
Well, put it this way: we are imperfect creatures, and when we make decisions in our hopes of acting ethically, the reality is we don't have unlimited information about the circumstance that we're deciding about. And therefore, it's inevitable we're going to make mistakes. Inevitable. We make mistakes. We do things that are unethical from time to time. The desirable antidote to that is to be open to feedback. When somebody says to me, "Hey, you just did this, this, or this, looks unethical to me," I want to be able to stop and think about that. Say, well, maybe you're right. Maybe I did something I shouldn't have done. And that's an important part of acting ethically, is having that open mind and being aware. We're going to make mistakes. I guarantee it. We've got to be forgiving of ourselves for making mistakes and willing to change our minds.
It's sounding to me like the metaphor, I guess it's the metaphor, is health, good health. That we're striving for good health, we're striving for an ethical life, and so we're looking for an absolute good that can never really be attained, possibly. You know, there's nothing that's, you know, you can't say something's absolutely healthy, you know, but you can always do things that are more healthful, more ethical, more. So I mean, I think there's kind of a level of abstraction that we have to learn to live with.
I agree. Absolutely. It's not learning to adopt a valid ethic and live by it to the best of our ability. This is not something you do overnight. You know, here we are reading this book that describes these steps, but it's a whole other thing to actually incorporate that into your day-to-day, moment-to-moment thinking and acting. And that takes work. That doesn't happen instantly. Just because you're hearing these words doesn't mean that you're going to start acting significantly better, more ethically in your life. Some people will. Most people, it's going to take time. It's going to take time to absorb these ideas. I do believe that for most people, the key to getting this whole process going in your own life is to understand the basic definitions involved. If you don't have the language in place to be able to describe to yourself your own process of decision making, you're at a huge disadvantage from day one. So when I say an ethic consists of these two parts and may or may not be valid, this is very foundational. What do you call it? I'm defining some terms that make the rest of this whole process work. And if you don't understand those terms fully, well, it takes time to understand them fully. You've got to experiment with it. You've got to, you know, put your action where your intention is. The Jewish community has a saying, put your tuchus on the table, tuchus on the tish. It means put your ass on the table. You know, put some of your skin in the game. Take some risk. And you've got to do that in order to fully appreciate the power of these ideas. These are powerful ideas. These are transformative ideas that can transform the whole world if they could become well known enough and popular enough. But there's no guarantee that's going to happen. None at all. In fact, it's not the most probable outcome. Do it anyway.
At this point in the conversation, I brought up the subject of a DRO, which is a dispute resolution organization, a piece of libertarian science fiction about how things may work in the future. For more better definition, I'll just quote from findwords.info, where they say, the phrase dispute resolution organization was coined by right libertarian Stefan Molyneux in his self-published white paper, The Stateless Society and Examination of Alternatives. Molyneux posits that within the theoretical stateless society, a dispute resolution organization would be a private firm that would enforce contracts and resolve disputes on behalf of their clients, replacing services previously handled by governments. The firms would be voluntarily contracted to provide or coordinate with other firms to provide services such as mediation, reimbursement for damages, personal protection, and credit reporting. In essence, they combine qualities borrowed from modern private defense, police, insurance companies, credit ratings, and alternative dispute resolution. Hypothetically, DROs would operate under a system of anarcho-capitalism. It has been suggested that such firms would compete within a free market, with the reliability and quality of their service monitored by independent ratings agencies. Customers also would have their reputations reported to ratings agencies by the DROs. In essence, this is something like, as stated, police or insurance company credit rating, with the exception of it including consent. That it's something that you choose and you sign into, and you can sign back out of it any time.
Now, when it comes to the word opinion, I use that word from time to time, and if you hear me say this is my opinion, what it means is that I have enough evidence to believe that this statement is probably true, but I have yet to actually prove it. I haven't put in the time, done the work to actually prove that statement is true, but I have enough evidence to suspect that it is, I may act in accordance with that opinion. Because proving that something is true can take a lot of work, and I only have so many hours in my day, so many years in my life, and I can't prove everything. I just don't have the resources to prove every opinion of mine to be in alignment with objective reality. So we take our best guess, we make decisions, we make mistakes, and hopefully we learn to correct those mistakes and learn from them. I have a hypothesis about the psychopath. My hypothesis, again, this is in the vein of opinion since I haven't proven it, but I suspect that they represent a kind of evolutionary dead end. If you think about evolution as a tree, where each branch, each splitting of the branches represents an alternative set of outcomes, and you see that there are whole species that wind up not surviving because they are what we think of as evolutionary dead ends, that they don't continue to evolve and they wind up disappearing. Well, it's quite plausible to me that the psychopath is that sort of creature, that they're not fully evolved, never will be, and eventually will die out because they don't have what it takes to survive in a world where mutual consent and win-win transactions have to take place for the species to do well. And I do think that we humans have evolved to the point where, for the most part, we are able to get along with each other because we are able to resolve our differences to more or less cure the disharmony that occurs between us. By resolving those differences between us, we're able to make better decisions collectively. That is, as groups, we make better decisions over time. There's a lot of repercussions to this hypothesis. We don't have time today to go into all of it, I'm sure. But it's an idea that strikes me as having some plausibility. The question really becomes, as I see it, how are we to respond ethically to people who are incapable, for whatever reason, incapable of empathy towards others? What's the rational and ethical way of responding to those people in our society? I've given that a lot of thought, and it is, I think that some of those thoughts are included in the book. And if not, it's still something we can talk about.
Well, that is the big question. And we bring it down to community versus the human race. I like using the old terms that we used to use that have magically changed from the human race to the species. But if we look at a community, is it unethical, let's be blunt, to kill somebody who turns out to be that psychotic, that insane? I mean, do we kill someone? And does the ethics allow you to come to that conclusion, or does the ethics only give you guidance as to what the answers are supposed to be, without necessarily ever being able to prescribe the right action?
Well, again, it's something I've given a lot of thought to. And the conclusion that I have drawn is that there are only two solutions. One is exile. In other words, if we had a region on the planet, and I'm not sure that it's even possible to create such a region, but if we had a region in which we could confine the psychopaths and maybe some of the sociopaths, we give them a backpack full of food and tools, a decent knife, some fire starting equipment, and we send them off into that realm with one another, and they have to deal with each other. But we're no longer dealing with them. I think this would be an ethical outcome, but it would require quite an investment in the infrastructure to make such an exile possible. And the alternative would be, as you suggested, to kill them. I can't think of any other way to keep them from having this tremendous negative impact on our society besides those two. And if you can come up with another alternative that would make them not able to continue having this negative impact, I'd be glad to hear it.
Well, can I just say real quick, because I think this is where I go back to my Wild West. Because the problem with the collective ethic is the collective guilt with that solution. So the solution is the Wild West, is the fact that we're not looking for a collective ethic and we don't live by one, because then, people get hit by cars or whatever, and I think when we think of the Wild West from the old time life commercials where, I would love to remember this guy's name, but he was so mean he once shot a man for snoring. And it was a Time Life series on the Wild West, the Old West. And I think that's kind of what we think of, is this sort of craziness. But if we look at something as sporadic, they say 8%, and I'm not even sure that statistic can be considered valid, but they say 8% of the population are sociopathic or whatever. If the society would just get out of the way, somebody would step up and solve the problem. And it may not be, and it may seem I'm directing it that this is going to be somebody kills somebody. It may not even be that. I mean, there could be some Christ-like person that discovers the saintliness in somebody and turns them around. But it's this need for a collective action that ends up becoming the big sticking point with all of the solutions and all of our history, where we look at periods in history where there weren't an overriding law which represented the overriding ethic.
Well, you'll notice that in what I said, exile or death, I didn't say that the collective has to be mandating death. It could be the individual. In some settings, you hear that an armed society is a polite society.
Yes.
And I think there's some truth to that.
I'm thinking of an alternative process here, in the form of the Wild West, where, in essence, they were living by a code, but they weren't living by this particular code. If we imagine the semi-apocryphal, semi-valid view, less wild, more West, but at the same time still quote-unquote lawless. Part of what made it a safer society than we think it was the fact that there was danger of no law, external law being applied. So people were like, like being on your best behavior, because anyone could shoot you dead if and get away with it. So you didn't piss off people for nothing, And I'm wondering if all of this codifying things is just a way of handling some really just interpersonal issues. I mean, I'm reading a lot about narcissists and how, I suspect I grew up with a few of them. And the elite, the global elite, seem as if it's just a club of narcissists. And that in the end, all these treatises on ethics could be just a lot of foundational fluff for the fact that you've just got to deal with a few assholes in the world, and if we didn't deal with those few assholes as they are, without any sort of, formality, it would all be over with, and we'd all be getting along much better.
I have an opinion on that.
Yeah.
Notice I called it an opinion.
Yeah.
Current thinking about the psychology of such asshole behavior is that psychopaths lack a part of the brain that is necessary for empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are born psychopaths, whereas sociopaths learn to act like psychopaths as a result of certain kinds of childhood trauma that has caused them to adapt to that circumstance in their life when they're quite young, and they mimic the behavior of psychopaths. If they are not fundamentally psychopathic, they weren't born that way, they were conditioned to be that way. And both groups exhibit traits that are highly narcissistic. And one can be a narcissist and not be a psychopath or a sociopath. There are hardcore narcissists who mess up our lives a lot just because they're so narcissistic.
Right.
And of course, there are combinations. We're talking here about character structure, and most people have a mixed character structure. Some of this, some of that, some of the other thing, and we have an internal compromise that we've made in terms of how we live our lives. The only meaningful solution to this that I have found is for people to really spend some time and effort to understand their own the impact of their own childhood on their own lives. Because if I don't know who I am and how I got to be who I am, I can't possibly interact ethically and honestly with those around me. I'll be always representing myself as being somewhat different than I really am. So knowing yourself to the bone is a very valuable undertaking in order to be able to sustain ethical relationships. It's very fundamental. There are other alternatives. For instance, if someone is identified by someone else as being psychopathic or dangerously sociopathic, one thing that you can do is you can say, okay, I don't want to take on the individual responsibility of executing that person. Let's hold a trial. We need 8 people, and we form a short-term octologue in order to decide together, as best we can, the ethics of how to deal with that individual. And if you get a unanimous decision that the only reasonable outcome is to kill him, then he gets killed. But it's no longer, it's not a big societal legal thing, and it's not an individual whimsy thing. It's a group of people who are committed to acting ethically, who take on the responsibility of making a life or death decision. To me, that would be, I would find that to be an acceptable way of handling that situation.
Well, this is again where I feel like the analysis creates this solving a problem that doesn't exist. I mean, if you look at Butler Schaefer's book on it's not chaos, but you know, yeah, or like organization from chaos or something like that. And again, if you look at, it's like Stefan Molyneux wouldn't be able to has never had a convenience store in the bad part of town. Who the hell gives a shit who walks into your door to buy product from you and wants a goddamn dossier on everybody that walks in the door? You are bordering on psychopathic yourself. I mean, there's something wrong with you. I mean,
there's another problem. There's another problem with that. That to create the DAO or anything logically equivalent to it, you've got to have an algorithm that understands ethics, and an algorithm cannot understand ethics. No matter how sophisticated the algorithm, it's again a set of rules.
There's something to this that really strikes me as a childish utopian fantasy, because
which this are you referring to?
Just like even the transaction thing and being able to trace everything, it's like I don't think that's the real world. You're putting people together in these dynamics, and in some cases I kind of get a feeling like people are putting a kick me sign on their back, like rip me off and see if you can. And other people that are,
Does anyone here disagree with what you're saying? Because I don't.
Okay, well, I'm just describing what this free market anarchist world keeps coming up with solutions that are not solutions, because they're just.
Some of them are worse than the thing they're trying to cure.
Exactly. I mean, I live in an apartment building, and we're talking about, I guess there's people that come to dump their trash in our dumpsters. And all these solutions at the meeting were like, let's have the gate on 24 hours a day, and and someone talked about their, a complex in Florida where they got the guard there. It's like, I don't want to live in a prison. If there's something, if you need me to stand watch on the weekends to make sure outsiders aren't dumping their sofas, I'm more inclined to do that than to sit there and have to have guests, show identification just to come to visit me or something like that. I can't stand the idea of living in a prison. Okay. And if the solution is that's not a solution. And I get too angry with that from the anarchist libertarian community. It's like, where the hell are you coming from?
Well, I can hear that you feel very strongly about this, and I'm in agreement with what you're saying. And I don't hear any of it contradicting the principles that I've recommended, that I've written about in the book. So I really, it strikes me that you have a hot button, and there are certain kinds of events that trigger your button. And I don't blame you. I mean, this is, I have similar reactions at times, to the extent that I let myself get triggered by anything, which isn't very much, but I think you're right on that in some ways the absence of rules. Now, mind you, I wrote this book in 2013, 2014, and I've grown quite a bit since then, because in this chapter I do describe what I regard as ethical law, but for the most part, I don't believe in law these days. I believe that law is a construct invented by people who want to control me, and that the lawmakers are engaging in politics. And my definition of politics is very simple. I think that politics is the art of self-serving manipulation. That this is the fundamental nature of politics. Self-serving manipulation.
I love that.
Now, if you accept that, and if you accept that the state, so-called, is a fiction, no more real than Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, then you understand that the government is a group of people who behave, whether they believe it or not, as if the state was a real thing. even though it's not. We know it's not. It's a fiction. Somebody wrote some things on some words on paper and said, aha, we have a state now. You have to obey. Well, that's bullshit. Don't keep buying into that. So had I understood that when I wrote this book, I would have written it a little differently, basically pointing out the irrelevance of politics to anything that really matters, other than the fact that the predatory class uses that machinery to plunder us. We live in a plunder state. It's a free-range insane asylum that is run by the worst of the inmates.
Oh, yeah.
So I suggest we move on
Yeah.
and continue the discussion here. You okay with that, Gilbert?
I'm good. I'm good.
I've got to turn off the sound when I talk because we both got the listening to the thing. But I Gilbert, what you said about the Wild West. I mean, there are accounts of the Wild West in which local sheriffs basically carried out a peaceful resolution to the circumstances by essentially being out there without a gun and looking for inequity. And when they found inequity, they would basically solve the problem. And so I do feel like there's a rule that I would use when it came to construction projects. I call it the no bullshit rule. And essentially, it's one in which harm is being done to somebody. Like if I'm doing something screwing somebody else, call me out on it because I don't want bullshit to happen, and that serves for everybody. If I'm doing something that's screwing somebody else, call me out on it, and let's solve it. So to me, I don't necessarily. I think that's an example of a rule. I don't know. You can call it a guideline if you want, but to me, it is something that works. And I would say that in most cases, what that does is it allows people to really understand what ethics is all about. Because if there's no bullshit, then more than likely we're succeeding, and everybody is succeeding.
Fair enough.
It's like you guys are already in this meta world that Zuckerberg wants you in, wants us all in, and it's like, I don't know. I really think world travel has got to be essential, because if people, traveled, they wouldn't have this fantasy notion like they're going to solve all the problems. Like, I'm going to start a business and no one walking in the door is ever going to dine and dash on me or rip me off, or I'm going to do a construction project and the guy's always going to pay me on time. Or I don't know. It's like part of it is fantasy land living, and that's why they're so susceptible to these technological solutions that will take away the chance of error, or oh my God, and I would caution the liberty community because they've jumped into this word consenting adults crap. It's like it's a psyop word, It's like I say, if you open up a convenience store, you're consenting for everyone to walk in the door. Well, yeah, you are, but you're not consenting to the robber. But it's like you understand that's shoplifting is going to happen, or it's like there's something about that term that just it is so childish, and
It's an oxymoron when you apply that to consent to be governed, consent to be ruled. It's an oxymoron.
And that's what
Absolutely
they want to
oxymoronic.
see. Thank you. That's exactly what they want to see. That's the psyop right there, is to get us using that word so that we recognize that we consented to the authorities. I was wondering exactly where the motive was for coming up with that term, and that's it exactly. Thank you. I just knew it rubbed me the wrong way.
I'm not surprised. For those that are interested, I wrote quite a while back, I wrote an article about the elements that make up a valid ethical contract. So I'll make that available here.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I do believe it's possible to have ethical contracts, and it's not easy, but it takes some forethought.
It does become a teachable thing. I mean, we are teaching ethics, but we're also in the one step down that makes it more practical. We're teaching etiquette, and the rules of etiquette coming from ethics they're non-legal, but they're certainly binding. And the more of a society has follows the rules of etiquette and has good manners, it can be well armed or whatever.
That's where the principles come in.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got a definition of a valid ethic, and then you derive from that a set of principles that tells you how to apply the ethic in various circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And we did cover a set of principles. I don't know if it's sufficient, but it's a dozen or 14 principles that I laid out that come directly from the definition of the ethic and that help us to apply the ethic moment to moment, day by day. So I want to respond to the natural law issue that you brought up. I think that natural law is an arguable premise. I think that this whole discussion of ethics could be reframed as a discussion of natural law. I think that there is an equivalency between the two ways of sorting one's thoughts. And all of these ideas are nothing more than that. They are a model or an intellectual map that describes a feature of reality, and the map is not the territory, and one can certainly have multiple maps that describe the same territory using different language, different definitions, and I think that natural law is one of the logically equivalent ways of describing the ethics. I did say earlier in this chapter that there are logically equivalent ethics that I'm not going to go cover in detail, and I think this is one of them. That the natural law view, which is closely allied with the Wild West view, these to me make sense. And I think that for my own purposes, the way I have defined these terms is a little bit more useful. But, I mean, I'm used to, as a scientist, I'm used to thinking in terms of natural laws like the law of thermodynamics and the laws of electrodynamics and relativity and so on. These are natural laws. Very hard to translate those natural laws into a set of behavioral constraints. Whereas if I talk about ethics, it's very easy to see how the principles that derive from the ethic result in very easily understood constraints on our behavior. So I prefer to use the one formulation, and I recognize the validity of the natural law formulation. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a little more complicated when it comes to trying to explain it. I do believe that intuition is a very valuable trait, and I do believe that some of the most important happenings in the world are right brain events. And in fact, I'm working on a strictly right brain project now to provide an auditory antidote to the craziness that we see going on in the world around us. It's a big project, a big chore, but I'm working on it every day, and I will report on the results when I have more of the project done.
That sounds cool. Are you familiar with John Rappaport and his work? He talks a lot about imagination. So
Yeah.
You mentioned creativity, but I think if they're in the same vein and stuff, and intuition. Are you familiar with his work?
Not really. I've run across bits and pieces of it, and I've heard about it, but I haven't familiarized myself with it.
He's definitely on the side of imagination.
Yeah.
I mean, he's
I told someone earlier today, I told someone, imagination is the spark that ignites inspiration. And I think there's something to that.
yes, but also it's also it may be kind of a feedback loop, because then the inspiration inspires imagination, which sparks. You get the spark again. It's like, yeah, it's this
Spark, spark, spark.
yep. And the
I love it.
because he also refers to being able to create our own universes. I mean, he starts from the practical to the amazing, and as you stated, and I've read in many places that so many of these scientific advancements really came from a dream or something like that. It wasn't even, it wasn't like the next
Right.
logical step in the, like you were saying, it's like not that was necessarily the next step in the, that you would think in the progression, and it came from a dream or something. I've heard that I think Sikorsky had a dream where he was walking down an aisle with a blue aisle with little lights.
Mm.
And years later, as an adult, he's like walking down an airplane aisle, and it struck him as the dream that he had had as a child.
Mm. It's not a necessary part of this discussion, but at some point I would be willing to share with the group 3 experiences I had for which I cannot come up with any rational, logical, or scientific explanation of those experiences. They were beyond anything I can imagine as a rational explanation for them. And to me, those 3 experiences are wonderful and mysterious and reaffirm my understanding that there's these unprovable, unlikely things that happen all the time. Events with 0 probability occur all around us all the time.
Yeah.
So I'll be happy to discuss that some other time, because I'm starting to run out of steam, and I feel like I've contributed about as much as I can to today's meeting as I'm able. So
I can't wait for the next time, or when we get that story, because I'm definitely interested. And I appreciate you coming by for these. Quite frankly, I think it's fantastic to have the author. I'm a bibliophile, so
I am thrilled to be here. Believe me, this is really, to me, this is a really important undertaking that we are doing together. And I really love it that you guys are on board with this. So, what do you say we call it night? All right.
thank you, everybody. Cheers and have a good night.
Thank you all for being here. I'm really happy that you're here.